Okay, so I guess we are at the final clock and we're all tired of 2.5 days, so try to be not too long. And so this is joint work with Seppo Honkapohja. So Seppo was originally scheduled to present this paper, but unfortunately he fell ill, and his last I heard that he's back home and recovering. So hopefully he'll get well. He said that he should be back at work at the end of August. So. Okay, so the idea is that we know that in Japan since the 1990s and Europe and the US since the 2007 financial crisis, the effective lower bound for interest rates has become a real constraint for monetary policy in practice. It's analytically, as Jim kind of mentioned in his dinner speech, or showed in his dinner speech, that it's also known that kind of Taylor type interest rate rules may lead to multiple equilibria. So in a sense that, like shown by Benabid, Schmidt, Uribe in their paper, Jet paper, beginning. So if there might be two steady states in these circumstances. So there is the desired steady state with the targeted inflation and output, and however if there is a zero low bound in interest rates, then there is also a kind of undesired or unintended steady state with possibly deflation and low output levels. So that's a kind of if there are kind of big shocks, there might be convergence to the undesired steady state. So to come back to the reality, so new monetary policy tools have been introduced, and forward guidance is one of them. So there is one type of forward guidance you might think of is the announcement of future plans of the interest rate, for example. And so another way to think of it, like Woodford and Carney and so on have mentioned, is in terms of a threshold for a target variable, so like price level or nominal GDP, for example. So there have been suggestions that these some of the price level instead of inflation targeting, some of the policy regimes like price level targeting, for example, might be a better policy in these circumstances. So one of the reasons to mention is that history dependence is a kind of feature of these policies. So in a sense, under inflation targeting, kind of buy once or buy once. So if there is negative inflation shock with inflation below target, then the policymaker tries to bring the inflation back to the targeted level. On the other hand,
this is, of course, like everybody says, an interesting paper, and so the point of it is to try and help explain what's happening to the distribution of the sacrifice ratio. And again, the key thing that the paper is all about is that distribution, what's happening to the spread of sacrifice ratios. Some of the novel parts of it are this idea of credibility through one parameter, which is kind of nice. Right? We like parsimony. Of course, at an expectations conference, it's also really nice that it happens to flow through the expectation formation process as well. I kind of think that's a very nice feature. So it's done by combining, as Chris was pointing out, rational, in quotes, rational expectations and adaptive learning. And one of the things that Chris didn't really stress too much, although he said there's this 171 disinflation episodes, one of the reasons why that comes about is because he's studying non-OECD countries. The original Ball paper and another paper that they cite are only looking at OECD countries. And so that's one of the things that they do slightly differently, and we'll talk a little bit more about that data. So the results are basically that credibility may help explain where that distribution is headed and how skewed it happens to be. This happens when agents rely more on past information. The mean and the skewness increase a little bit. Again, as Chris pointed out in that last slide, the mean doesn't increase quite as much as the skewness does. The skewness tends to increase way more than the mean does, which is kind of desirable given what the actual data seems to tell us about sacrifice ratio. The other point that I found really kind of fascinating that Chris didn't have time to go through in his paper was that announcements are beneficial even with low credibility. So being able to pre-announce that you're going to have a disinflation episode actually helps even when there's low credibility, which is kind of a key thing for monetary policymakers in that kind of situation. Just because you don't have credibility doesn't mean you shouldn't tell people what you're doing. So I just came off of sabbatical, and I work at a small liberal arts college, so I'm getting ready for faculty meetings with humanists and lots of people who care about language. So I went back and started looking at language of how the description of the data happened to be set up. So, small little changes in wording were kind of important in terms of the data set, and it's one of the reasons why the data set, the number of disinflation periods happen in this data set. On some level, I don't quite know what to make of it in the sense of, okay, these are just, here's my criteria, so my data has changed. I don't think it's that important for the actual results that are looking in, or that Chris ends up having. But it is going to have some sort of effect on the distribution, and I think there's actually a point that could be made that might be very, very important, given the types of things that this paper is looking at. So the first two are the main papers that Chris happens to talk about when he's talking about which disinflation episodes they discard. And the main differences happen to be in red, which is that Ball is looking at trend inflation as the cutoff number that we're looking at. Goncalves and Carvalho are looking at initial inflation, and Chris and Mariano were looking at the disinflation, how the size of the disinflation. So those are slightly different conditions and slightly different numbers, but not anything crazy. What that means is that there are a lot of hyperinflation episodes that Mariano and Chris have in their data. On some level, that's really good, I think. I think they want that, given that they're trying to get this huge distribution from all of these non-OECD countries. You're going to be getting. Also, you don't want to discard an entire country just because they happen to have over 20% inflation in the 1960s. They might be perfectly reasonable to study in the 1990s or the 2000s. So I think it makes a lot of sense on some level. My suggestion would be to be more sort of, instead of looking at the disinflation, how much has been disinflated, just look at what the inflation rate was at the beginning of the episode, so that you could take out the hyperinflation cases, which is pretty much the same thing as what you have here, except there are a few of these cases where there's hyperinflation, 300%, let's say, and even if it goes down 50% less than 50% over that time, you still have 250% inflation. Now, do you want to call that a disinflation episode? Well, yeah, inflation went down, but it's still so high, I'm not sure whether we really want to count that. My guess is that it's not going to change your picture all that much if I look through it, but it would also allow you to sort of describe the quantitative differences between hyperinflation disinflations and non-hyperinflation disinflations, and there may be something there that you might be able to talk about later on in the paper. I'll talk some more. This point you actually brought up in because it was brought up from a question about the timing of the information set in adaptive learning. It wasn't entirely clear from the text that you did this, so it makes me feel a lot better now. So it's the time t-1 in terms of the adaptive learning agents are just using t-1 information as opposed to t is kind of important. The other thing, and I think it's probably just an expositional thing in the same way, The Ireland model has autocorrelated errors, and the general model that you start off with doesn't really. Thanks. And I'm not sure when you say the MSV solution in that particular model, whether you're thinking of the rational expectation solution including the autocorrelated shocks. A simple way to sort of make it clear to the reader is just connect back to the model, the general model that you started doing. So basically, tell the reader what y is relative to your original model. So once that Ireland model is estimated on data, the parameter values are used, or some of the parameter values are used, and then some of them are calibrated to generate those distributions that you saw at the end of Chris's paper. So knowing which ones are estimated and calibrated in some cases was very clear, and in other cases it was less clear. So just being a little bit more obvious about that would be nice. And then one of the things, and of course as a learning person, this is what pops into your head. Was also estimated. The model was also estimated on Argentinian data as well as U.S. data, but the gain was the same across both of those, and it's not entirely. So it wasn't. The gain was never estimated. It's calibrated, and it was assumed that they would have the same gain. And I don't have. My hunch is that they probably shouldn't be. So, just having simulations with some higher gain value, my prior is that they would have higher gain values because they're more worried about structural change than it would be in the US. So that's just something that would be nice. And the other thing that wasn't entirely clear, you did give some information about what types of inflation levels you'll see in the simulations. But I wasn't entirely sure how many of those could be hyperinflation. Again, to get back to the point of where you should separate the data that you collect, it might be nice to sort of be able to say, are there hyperinflation episodes in here? And if not, what would happen if you could push the model to actually generate those kinds of hyperinflations? So like I said, it's not this sort of novel explanation. It hasn't been entirely obvious why there's such a big distribution of sacrifice ratios, and this credibility model seems to be doing a very good job. This larger, more robust set of data, because we've got a lot of non-OECD countries, is kind of useful and gives us a better idea of really how wide that distribution happens to be for these sacrifice ratios. And again, didn't go into the details of this, and Chris wasn't able to either, but the policy and I think you could put even more emphasis on the policy announcements, because I think that's actually really important for monetary policymakers. So thanks.
Okay, thanks very much.
So thank you for the comments. So actually, your first comment is a good point about why we didn't change. So I actually have to admit that I didn't even think about that we actually may have caught some of the hyperinflation episodes in there. So we actually did the 50% change because we wanted to roll out hyperinflation episodes the same way that the previous literature had done, but we didn't want to cut it off at 20, because if you cut it off at 20, you miss the number of South American disinflations, which we know to have been intended. And so we just wanted to make sure we caught all those. But I really should maybe think closely about the cutoff I actually did, because I may have captured some of the hyperinflation where you went from 300 to 250. So thank you for that. So about the point about the gains. So we're already moving around so many parameters in this model. I mean, what we're really just trying to show is that there is a distribution of sacrifice ratios that apply by these models if you take the shock seriously, and our method of credibility can move that distribution around in a way that could be interesting to policymakers if you sort of buy the framework we're doing. We're not, so to the extent that we're just trying to illustrate that, I think we just were super interested in playing around with what happens if gain is 0.2 versus gain is 0.02 versus 0.03. But it definitely inflation thing, so in the steady state inflation doesn't matter for this model, so all that matters is changes in inflation, so it doesn't really matter. I don't think it's also good to push this model too hard into high inflation regimes, just because sort of the way some of the things like price taking and stuff we would imagine are much different in high inflation periods than they are low inflation periods. So I think just thinking about sort of relatively low inflation changes is probably all that I'm comfortable doing, even though we do 10% can be large, and we do consider some larger ones than that. But yeah, so thank you.
Okay, George with a question.
I have just two quick comments. It's mostly terminological. I think you should call the rational forecasting model the textbook rational forecasting model. And everyone knows right away what
Okay.
this means. And it's also very plausible that, right, you're a forecaster, you've got different ways of forecasting. Here's one that comes out of the textbooks. Why not? You know, and then you have this, as you say, just like policymakers run their models with rational expectations, and then they run vector level regressions and forecasts. That's what your agents are doing. They're using a weighted average. So I think if you just say textbook rational, I would clarify that. And then the same thing with lambda. I think that you need to say more crisply that lambda is an index of credibility.
Okay.
Right up front. Now, why would that be? Because really, they're doing a weighted average of forecasting models, so it's really a measure of how much weight you put on one forecasting model and the other. Well, I think in the back of your mind, in the back of our minds, is the idea that if you did this policy experiment many times, eventually people would learn to shift the weight towards lambda all the way to the rational expectations. And so in that sense, lambda is a good index of the credibility of the policy maker. Adaptive world that we did the politics of.
Thank you.
Other comments, Karsh?
Yeah, another comment. I have a student who did something similar. A model with endogenous credibility. It's basically a model with, we don't call it rational, we call it fundamentalist, who believe in the inflation target and output target. The other type is naive. And the credibility is time varying depending on the performance of those three. And we have causal pricing, and we also then look at zero lower bounds and whether or not liquidity traps arise. And what we find is that when credibility is low, then more likely you're going to end up with so.
Do you have what's the reference?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
I'll send it to you. Anyway, I think it's very interesting, and it's interesting. You sort of had the same idea. You call the lambda the credibility. Well, our lambda is time very. I think the way you look at it is an interesting way.
No?
Yeah, sort of along those same lines, I was wondering if you could think of sort of building credibility or having the time variant lambda, which would also sort of make you closer to the Cho-Casa kind of framework. And then just on the gain as well, I mean, obviously we were focusing on something different, but in the work of Tom and Tao, that was one of the things we estimated. I mean, we were focusing specifically on the hyperinflation. I mean, as you know, how big a gain is going to track how much the expectations move around, so that can be potentially important. And we found some pretty big differences across countries in how, I mean, as you might expect, how successfully their disinflation work was really key in determining our estimate of how big that gain.
Okay, let's thank our speaker. For the final talk.
Escape.
It's already escaped. Hit the button.
W.
Splat.
I don't know what this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you,
I can see this.
are you
yeah.
hoping to get rid of this slide?
That's right.
Okay.
I will open mine.
Which one is yours? Where, this one right there? Now do your splat L. Try it.
Is this one?
Splat L. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
You're doing great.
The backspace is.
We have a clicker over here. There you go.
Okay, so I guess we are this is the final talk, and we're all tired. 2.5 days, so try to be not too long. So this is joint work with Seppo Honkapohja. So Seppo was originally scheduled to present this paper, but unfortunately fell ill, and his last I heard that he's back home and recovering. So hopefully he'll get well. He said that he should be back at work by the end of August. So. Okay, so the idea is that we know that in Japan since the 1990s and in Europe and the US since the 2007 financial crisis, the effective lower bound for interest rates has become a real constraint for monetary policy in practice. It's analytically, as Jim kind of mentioned in his dinner speech, or showed in his dinner speech, that it's also known that kind of Taylor type interest rate moves may lead to multiple equilibria. So in a sense that, like shown by Benabid, Schmidt, Uribe in their jet paper beginning. So if there might be two steady states in these circumstances. So there is the desired steady state with the targeted inflation and output, and however if there is a zero low bound in interest rates, then there is also a kind of undesired or unintended steady state with possibly deflation and low output levels. So that's a kind of if there are kind of big shocks, there might be convergence to the undesired steady state. So to come back to the reality, so new monetary policy tools have been introduced, and forward guidance is one of them. So there is one type of forward guidance you might think of is the announcement of future plans of the interest rate, for example. And so another way to think of it, like Woodford and Carney and so on have mentioned, is in terms of a threshold for a target variable, so like price level or nominal GDP, for example. So there have been suggestions that these some of the price level instead of inflation targeting, some other policy regimes like price level targeting, for example, might be a better policy in these circumstances. So one of the reasons to mention is that history dependence is a kind of feature of these policies. So in a sense, under inflation targeting, kind of bygones are bygones. So if there is negative inflation shock with inflation below target, then the policymaker tries to bring the inflation back to the targeted level. On the other hand, if the bank is falling as a price level targeter, then if the negative, if the price level is below if as a result of a negative shock, if the price level is below the targeted path, then inflation will somehow have to be kind of higher than target. And so that kind of gives an extra boost to the economy through this kind of history dependence. So there is a kind of, so Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, has kind of mentioned this in a speech, like for GDP targeting, and Charles Evans has mentioned price level targeting, for example, as something which might be used to combat a liquidity trap management, which might be better for guidance ideas. And then relatedly, there is a lot of literature, Eggerson, which I will not kind of cite. Eggerson would, for example, show that something like price level targeting is really policy in the, under rational expectations and when there's a good economics behind. So what with Seppo we've done in a previous paper is that basically bring the adaptive learning viewpoint to analyze these types of policies, to analyze these alternative policies like price level targeting. And this framework, in that framework, we basically assume that agents did not. So those were kind of, in that framework, the monetary policies were kind of basically were kind of simple instrument rules where the interest rate would respond to measures of inflation or the price gap and so on. And agents did not have knowledge of this interest rate rule in that framework. So, so here, basically here we kind of examine the consequences of, say, knowledge or transparency or communication of these types of the interest rate policies to the agents, and what are the consequences of this assumption. So it's like what Eugene Preston have done in the Eugene macro paper. So in the previous book, we have shown that there is continues to be multiple steady states even under these alternative policies, and that will be still true here. And what is that it's the comparison kind of hinges on kind of by the way we see it as kind of whether agents incorporate forward guidance in a certain sense, which I'll tell you later, in their forecasting for the properties of price over targeting. So essentially, if inflation targeting is there is not much to choose in the absence of price level, in the absence of kind of this kind of forward guidance in the previous framework. And however, if that is incorporated, perhaps price level targeting might be a better regime. So, so basically, our idea is that broadly speaking, that if a pattern regime change or policy change is contemplated, generally it's important. We think it is important anyway to allow for imperfect knowledge about various variables, and so that's the adaptive learning viewpoint. And in addition, what we do is that we take a kind of nonlinear framework and try to analyze the global dynamics. So in this kind of framework. So so when kind of comparison of price over targeting with inflation targeting, say. So our kind of first criteria for kind of robustness of monetary policy regime is kind of the size of the domain of attraction of a targeted steady state. So typically, one can show that the desired or the high targeted steady state might be locally stable, and the other steady state, the low steady state, is not. So, but you might still want to know how far initial beliefs, say, of inflation output might be off, but still it will converge to the targeted steady state. So in a sense, you might think that big shocks, and if there are big shocks, so there's a lot of pessimism. If things are way off the targeted steady state, if there is still convergence to the steady state in a certain policy regime, you might have cause to believe or think that a regime is better than another regime, policy regime where only small shocks or small kind of lead to convergence to the target steady state, but bigger shocks do not. So that is one of the criteria which the main criteria which we used, and this and what we showed in that framework and here also, it shows that it depends. The price over targeting whether tends to have a big domain of attraction if somehow forward guidance in the way I'll tell you later is incorporated into the learning, and is better than inflation targeting. So you might think that even after a large pessimistic shock, things do come back to the target steady state in that case. However, if this is not true, then price over targeting does not improve upon inflation targeting. So if in a certain sense, if agents continue to say form inflation expectations as they would in a kind of inflation targeting regime, then there is not much to choose, and in fact, between the two policy regimes. So in this paper, as I said that we try to we analyze the issue when these policy rules are communicated. Also, one way to think of this as kind of transparency. So what, broadly speaking, what we find here is that transparency of the policy rule brings big improvements for the inflation targeting regime. For the price level targeting regime, there is not much of a difference, it seems. However, if, as in the previous framework, if forward guidance is used, then PLT, price level targeting, kind of improves quite a bit. And one arguably it might be better than inflation targeting. Of course, the choice is not that straightforward. So we, apart from looking at the kind of at this domain of attraction thing, we also compare, suppose there are, one is kind of reasonably close, that we define, see in the numerics what we have, say within 1 percentage point if inflation expectations and so on are within 1 percentage points of the steady state, then what are the dynamics of these variables as they converge towards the steady state? What are the fluctuations in the endogenous variables like inflation, output, interest rates, and so on as they converge to the steady state? We also see what is the kind of incidence of hitting the zero lower bound. It's sometimes, and what are the deflationary risks with these different policy regimes are there. So the idea would be that, here is that given initial beliefs of inflation output, then you look at the paths of inflation output and the interest rates for a significant, say 500 periods here, when they seem to have converged. And we look at the kind of the cumulative fluctuations in these variables as they converge the steady state. So overall, and this is what we kind of mean by the volatility. And also, how many times the interest rate hits the zero lower bound, or basically the inflation rate, gross inflation rate is less than 1, for example. So, and we also, another kind of case we consider is what is the effect. So there have been kind of arguments, mentioned by Blanchard and some authors, and also informally that it might be good to raise the inflation target, say it is 2%, it might be good to raise the inflation target to 3 or 4%, and because then the incidence of hitting the zero lower bound and the deflation risks might be low. So we kind of study this issue as well when the economy is subject, say to small and large expected shocks. And of course, we employ this nonlinear framework, and we impose the zero lower bound both for the actual and the interest rate forecasting agents. And so this is so that is the main kind of difference. So I didn't cite in the literature, but more other literatures mostly use linearized frameworks, as was also mentioned in the kind of previous talk, and including Williams is a paper which kind of does similar analysis, kind of linearized framework. So the model actually has been kind of used in Benjamin Schmidt, and Evans, Muzi, and Honkapohja, for example. So it really depends on consumption, rate balances, sees the aggregate consumption aggregator, labor supply, and it's a household firm economy. So there are Rothenberg cost of price adjustment, and these kind of affect the utility of the agent. So there is no distinction between the household firms. And so gamma is the lump sum tax, R is the non-interest rate factor, so standard notation, P is the price level, and inflation rate is the ratio of the two prices. So the utility function has this parametric form, which, and later on in the numerics, we'll actually assume log utility for consumption and rate balances. And production function is standard, and each firm traces the demand curve, which is downward sloping. So this is kind of standard framework. Government's flow budget constraint is standard, where they use debt, lump sum taxes, and government spending, government consumption, and with the flow budget constraint there. So fiscal policy follows kind of the passive is passive in the 3%. So lump sum taxes respond to past debt so as to pay off the increased interest as well as fraction of the increased principal. So, and the market clearing is there when we use just government spending is fixed throughout this analysis. And then, so once you do the boundary conditions, so the top one is basically the nonlinear version of the Phillips curve involving current and future inflation. And the second one is the standard consumption order equation, and then the demand for rate balances is the third one. And so these are, can be obtained. And so from here, without going into too much of the details, because I would like to show the results more, and it's a short presentation. and of course they are in the paper, is that if you make some simplifying assumptions, basically that isn't identical expectations, there are no random shocks in this economy. Log utility and center point expectations, so and agents say from past experience might have observed that the price is the same as the aggregate price of insulin for consumption per capita, then you can obtain a kind of Phillips curve or kind of a QT, which depends on current output and on expectations about the future output. So that's the version of the. Similarly, you can also get a consumption function for the household. Without again going to details, basically the last line is the important thing. We assume that their consumers are recording, so that the consumption depends on just government spending, and using basically the flow government budget constraint. They know that flow budget constraint. That means they are basically they're recording, and you get the consumption function which we have here. So that's the basically the framework we have on the policy frameworks, the policy rules. So we have the first equation 2 is kind of the inflation targeting. What we say is basically a standard Taylor type rule. So the interest rate, the nominal interest rate, responds to inflation and output, and it's active, so psi pi will be more than 1. And so in this case, in the previous paper, agents did not know this interest rate rule. Here we assume that they know kind of this rule and they use it, this rule. So it is kind of what we get transparency, as I've said before. So for the price of the targeting rule, so there is the rule is actually like equation 4. It's so here so xt is the price level gap, as we say. So essentially, instead of responding to inflation, the interest rate responds to this price level gap. So if this the interest rate is above the targeted steady state value of the instrument, when the actual price level is above the targeted price level path, or the percentage deviations, and similarly, it also responds to the output percentage output relative to the desired targeted output level. So these are the kind of the benchmark, or basically these are the two rules we have. One is the inflation, the Taylor type rule, which we kind of symbolize or think of as inflation targeting, and this price level targeting rule. So agents are assumed to know this price level target path, and so in a way one might think of that the price and the output gap terms kind of act as triggers for the lifting of the zero load bound. If the kind of this price gap or the price is to way off the targeted price of the path, then the interest rate might be stuck at the zero load bound. And so that might be what we thought of as triggers which lift the interest rate from its load bound if either actual price level output meets its target level.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with this. How does P bar T evolve?
So they will, it's an exogenous specifier at the very same rate of inflation pi star. So it will evolve at the same rate as pi star, the targeted inflation rate.
In normal times, the two rules are identical.
Sorry?
In normal times, far away from the zero lower bound, the two rules produce identical results.
No, because they respond to, well, one responds to the inflation rate and the other responds to the price of the gap.
But the target of the 2% or 2%.
The targeted inflation rate is the same in the both cases. So, so that's for expectations formation. There are two possible assumptions. So one is, so suppose you have this price level targeting regime, and so one is that they are used to kind of agents are used to forecasting inflation, say in this regime. And if they continue to say on the basis of past inflation data, and if they continue to do so under this regime, alternative regime called price level targeting, then we'll find that that's basically that's one way to do the expectations, form the expectations. So in a sense, might think that agents do not use the additional guidance from this targeted price level path. On the other hand, the second possibility might be that agents use the price level gap, or the announced targeted price level gap, use it to form their expectations of this price level gap, and from there kind of find the reduce the inflation expectations. So I'll show you the equation later on. So that is what we kind of say here, price level targeting with forward guidance. So point expectations learning. So basically, agents are forming the expectations of these variables like inflation, output, or relative prices based on past data of the same variable. So it might be, if omega t is t inverse, then it is decreasing in learning. If it's a constant, as has been talked about in this restaurant conference, then you basically weighing, it's a kind of exponential weighting of past data. So these expectations are, in this, we assume that the expectations are formed at the beginning period based on past data. So kind of t minus 1. In choosing the current decisions agents to use the current variables. If you in the case agents do not know the rule, like in the previous paper, agents would form forecasts, and then they form forecasts of interest rate based on, say, past interest rates. So here it is, this rule is known, so they will make use of this rule in forming the forecast of the interest rate of the future. So then you have got an aggregate demand relationship, and so with these expectations about future variables appearing, and depending on the rule, we'll have one or the other system. The nonlinear Phillips curve kind of repeated here. So with steady state, with the type of learning we have evolved, so you can basically feature forecasts are all the same as the kind of current kind of the forecast. So you can sum up those infinite sums which I showed earlier, and to get kind of the Phillips curve in this nonlinear version of the Phillips curve in this case, and similarly for the aggregate demand relation I forgot to mention. So this making use of those forms of learning, we can get these equations 5 and 6 to describe the demand and inflation in the economy. So I quickly, since so those are basically what our system, and since fiscal policy is passive, and so the bond dynamics and so on are not very relevant for our case. So under inflation targeting and transparency, there are two expectation variables: inflation and output. Under price level targeting, there is also the price level gap, XTE. So, say expectations of the future price level gap, as we call it, price level relative to the price level being targeted, and possibly relative output gaps. So, without knowledge of the interest rate rule, then as I said just a short while ago, they would form interest rate forecasts based on past data. So the evolution of expectations, as I said, is of this form, as shown on the bottom of the slide. So basically, simple learning rules based on, basically rules are based on past data. So I'll quickly just just mention that, I don't want to go spend too much time, that we're going to show that there are still kind of two steady states. The one is the high steady state and the desired steady state, and the other is the low steady state in this kind of framework. And you can show that the targeted or the high steady state is locally stable under learning, and the low steady state is known. So that's now I want to come to the kind of different way agents may form expectations in the price level targeting regime.
You have multiple steady states in both type of policies?
Yeah. So it's as I said, this is kind of repeating, but it's worth that under inflation targeting, agents, in a sense, the interest rate response to inflation rate, and the agents form the expectations of inflation based on past inflation. So they might, if that is what they are used to doing, they might do the same under enterprise level targeting regime. If say, so that's kind of because that kind of one might think of this as they are used to doing that. And the second one, as I said, is that if they might use the announcement of this price level target path to form the expectations. So what do I mean here? So one, you can basically equation 19 is a kind of definition. The price level gap is of that form. Today's price level gap depends on the last period times the inflation rate divided I start. So in a sense, without the guidance, as we say, the inflation expectations by T in the future will be based on the past inflation rates. Here, they will make use of this relation. So they will form forecasts of the future price level gaps and make use of that to form their inflation forecasts. So that gives, so one might, if you move the equation one time period forward, you can get the inflation forecast as in 20. So basically, agents are forming forecasts of the price level gap, as I mentioned, and from there, they deduce the implied inflation forecast. So XTE is the future forecast of the price level gap. That XTE is basically the forecast of the current gap in the beginning of the period. So one might presume that that is equal to the last price level gap, or it might be a weighted average of this last price level gap and XT minus 1E. And so in the numerics, we actually impose omega 1, 1. So the first criteria, domain of attraction. I have 13 minutes left, right? So,
You're doing great.
okay, but that's what we... Anyway, so first criteria was the domain of attraction. So how far can you be from the targeted steady state, but still get convergence to the desired steady state? So we use so the annual inflation rate is 2%, so pi star 1.005.5% per quarter, and so it's reasonable, parameterizations we have used. One thing is that in the numerics, we assume that, if interest rate expectations kind of revert to the steady state value after a certain time period, which is assumed to be t equals 28, because if they are, kind of negative for a long infinite number of periods, the consumption function is not well defined. So this has been noted earlier in peer work by George and Seppo. The gain parameter is of 0.002. Based on this, these are the steady states, the two steady states. As George was hinting earlier, there is not much difference in the output levels, but the inflation rate is different. So, for example, and for the inflation targeting, these are the standard policy parameters. For price level targeting, you kind of use Williams, some values which Williams in his paper in 2010 has used. So partials, of course, this is a big space, so we kind of think of partial domains of attraction. So we let initial expectations, initial beliefs of inflation and output be off. So it ranges from certain ranges. So it's a pretty big range, as you can see. Pi naught E ranges from 1.935 to 1.065. So that's like 6.5% per quarter, or 26% kind of annual inflation. So there's a big. So we want to have big shocks around the targeted steady state and see whether there is convergence or not to the targeted steady state. So that's the spirit of this exercise. And what output varies also around this. And
So are you doing this using real-time learning or simulating the different?
simulating, yeah.
The difference between.
No, it is real time. And so without forward guidance, as in the sense I use, with price level targeting, so around the horizontal axis is the output expectations and the vertical is the inflation. The red circle is the desired steady state. The blue is the unintended. So as you can see that, the shaded region is where initial beliefs of expectations of, these are the initial beliefs of inflation and output expectations which lead to convergence to the targeted steady state. No, and the other regions don't, so the right. For IT inflation targeting, as you can see that there is, that's the domain of attraction. So in a sense, neither kind of contains the other, but for deflationary deflation rates, on the right, like lower, there is convergence. So, in a sense, it might look, inflation target looks kind of better. So just to say that, so this is the case which we are analyzing now with transparency. In the previous paper, we did it without knowledge of the rules. So there seems to be, for price level targeting, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. For inflation targeting, there seems to be a difference. So this is the, without transparency, the domain of attraction. So with, however, with forward guidance in the case of price level targeting, as I defined earlier, you could also compute domains of attraction. So in this case, you think of, apart from output expectations, relative price expectations, which are away from the kind of the targeted value, which you can think of one, basically. And so based on, generally it seems to be very robust. Even if you start from very close to the deflationary or the low steady state, there is convergence to the targeted steady state. And you know, it's these are the ranges which one has done. So X naught E ranges from 0.1 to 2, which is a pretty, you know, price level is so far away from the targeted price level gap. And still, you know, basically it seems that there's always kind of convergence to the targeted steady state. So if the forward guidance in this sense is incorporated, then there's a dramatic difference to the properties of price level targeting. So intuitively, I don't have much time. Basically, if the fact that from the price level gap expectations, you can get to the inflation expectations in 22, and it kind of moves it. If the realized inflation falls far below target, the pi star, then inflation expectations basically begin to increase from its previous value. So that's in the right direction. And that's basically the path for the target path for the price level in a certain sense continues to influence the economy through the inflation expectations, even when the zero lower bound is mined. Further aspects of learning dynamics. So this was a kind of global perspective which we took, which we examine right now. And now I want to look at more locally. Say if you are starting relatively close by, and I'll say which in more sense, how much, not in more sense, but then how are the fluctuations, how do these various variables change over time as they converge to the steady state? So, and then you know, when these paths hit the zero lower bound or the bottom of deflation. So I would, there are, you know, one can, so essentially in the beginning, we let initial inflation expectations be 1% around the targeted steady state, and then similarly for relative price expectations, and the initial values of variables are chosen. These are not, you know, just numbers, and generally, you know, you can change them, but still get reasonably well with similar dynamics. But I don't want to go into the details. You get, you know, generally without forward guidance, you get kind of say cyclical dynamics of inflation, output, and interest rate. And that's this, and whereas with forward guidance, there is much more rapid adjustment to the steady state. So I don't have time, but you know, there is some intuition you can give for the cyclical dynamics for price level targeting, and it's related to the kind of, you know, the Philip version of Phillips curve. And but what I want to show you is like, you know, how does these various volatility measures, what we call, is look like in these different policy regimes. And both when inflation target is say 2%, as in the baseline case, and when it is higher at 4%, and also when there are small shocks hitting the economy, say 1% around the targeted steady state, or higher, say 2%, or even the last one is like 10%, so really high. So we want to see which regime kind of does better. So the idea in this volatility, as I said, it's a deterministic model, is that we have these initial beliefs of inflation expectations or output expectations and inflation targeting. For each given initial belief, we have a sequence of inflation, output, and interest rates, so on, over and for a certain number of time periods. And then we basically measure along all this, we measure the volatilities, and we report the median volatilities in this. We also report a loss function with a weight of 1 for inflation rate, 0.5 for output, and 0.1 for interest rate. That's Williams has used, and also the the kind of the median exposed utility that represents the consumer, and because we have a utility function. So say it's utilizing that one. So the results are here. So this table is the so NOG is no guidance and WIG is for with guidance, and so we may not have that much faith in what the weights and the loss of different weights are. So I also show you the volatilities, variances on inflation, output, interest rates separately. So as you can see that inflation volatility is lower under price level targeting without guidance does worse in all of these cases, which I'll show. So it's clearly the worst kind of regime in this framework. With guidance, so the relevant comparison is price level targeting with guidance and inflation targeting. So with guidance, the inflation volatility and the price level targeting is smaller, whereas for it is output volatility is smaller for inflation targeting, and interest rate volatility is smaller for inflation targeting, and the losses are there. And so there is as I said, that generally inflation targeting does seem to generally do better than price rate targeting. You might say it's debatable. As I said, there's a trade-off in inflation volatilities, for example. What about?
What's the loss? What are the units of the loss?
It basically multiplies the volatility of inflation in times 1 plus variance of, basically it is. It's basically multiplying the variance of inflation by 1, giving weight 0.5 to output and 0.1 to the interest rate. So it's kind of an unconditional loss. Right, so weighting these in the way and getting the loss. So now, so as you can see, this is the table from the previous paper, so without transparency. Okay. So as you can, there is a big difference, big benefit for inflation targeting when there is transparency of the interest rate. So as you can see, that was really the worst regime, and volatilities of inflation output are much higher, and inflation and interest rate are much higher. So there is a big difference for inflation targeting, but not much for price level targeting. So just to say that transparency is less obvious when it's but just what I kind of stated. Let's now look at fluctuations of 2% around that. So it's higher than big. So you might think of this as bigger shocks hitting the economy. Is one way. So the baseline inflation target is 2% in this case. So for table 3 is the relevant result. And the bottom table, really there may be the final 2 columns are more of interest, is that deflation is the number of times in all these simulations inflation is below 1. And zero lower bound is when we have a lower bound which is above 1 in the simulation, very small one, 1.0001. And when the interest rate is below 1.001. So it's kind of when interest rate is very low. So is what? So these are the percentage times, for example, in the final 2 columns, that inflation is below 1 or the zero lower bound is kind of hit. So as you can see, it is hit more often. Price level targeting again continues to be the worst. And just so the zero lower bound doesn't seem to be hit in the case of inflation targeting, it is significant kind of point quite a bit with guidance, price level targeting, but the deflationary risks are much smaller for price level targeting with guidance. And so this is and suppose you have the inflation target of 4%, that's the bottom, then these are the tables. So what happens is that with the higher inflation target, inflation, the volatility of inflation and interest rate for inflation targeting goes up. There's not that much of a difference for price level targeting with guidance. And however, the biggest benefits are in terms of the deflation risks and the zero lower bound being hit. They come down quite a bit for the 2 regimes. And that's finally, I think since I don't have time, I'll finish off with this. So this is the case when there are, so in the initial, the target rate of inflation is 4%, and the initial expectations of inflation are between 0 to 10. And you see that, and similarly relative price gaps. So as you can see that the volatility, generally, bigger shocks tend to raise the volatilities of inflation and interest rate under inflation targeting. There's not much difference under price level targeting. And what we conclude is that, and the zero lower bound is kind of hit in that way. So what the conclusion, which is that what from this, I showed you kind of a bit quickly the slide, but they are in the paper. But roughly speaking, that if the inflation target is kind of low 2% and there are small shocks hitting the economy, inflation targeting seems to be the better regime. If there are bigger shocks which hit the economy, then price level targeting with guidance seems to be the better regime in terms of these results. And of course, if you combine the kind of results in the domain of attraction, it's kind of better as well. So that's kind of a quick summary of what the results are.